Hello, my name is Constancia Mushoto. I'm an agricultural ecologist. I work as a researcher at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in the Natural Resources and the Environment Unit. The focus of my work is on applying transdisciplinary approaches to the management of the agriculture-environment interface for the purposes of maintaining agricultural production while maintaining the integrity of the natural resource base. In this presentation, I'm going to share with you experiences that we've had in applying a transdisciplinary approach to a research project. The objective of this presentation is to present and discuss an example of a transdisciplinary process applied in a research project. And I'll describe the process that we followed in the project, highlighting aspects such as stakeholder engagement, including the perspectives and levels of viewing issues that we came across. And then I'll go on to describe how we define the research agenda in the context of a transdisciplinary approach and the challenges that we found in applying the transdisciplinary process in a research context. The project that we applied the multidisciplinary process to is funded by the European Union and is a 4-year project which commenced in 2011 and will run until 2015. It is a multi-country project. There are 5 African countries involved in the project, and these are South Africa, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Tunisia, and Mali. The experiences that I'm going to share in this presentation are based on the South Africa countryside, and the location of the study in South Africa is in the Giani district in the Limpopo province in northeastern South Africa. The objective of the project is to increase food production in irrigated smallholder farming areas in Africa, while maintaining the integrity of the natural resource base that is ensuring healthy and resilient environments. The problem that the project is trying to address is low agricultural production, and in the particular context of South Africa, the problem is limited availability of water for irrigation, and there's also land degradation, and this manifests as low soil fertility and soil erosion. There are several drivers of the problem, and these include water shortages and limited capacity of stakeholders to address the problem. The project is meant to result in improved strategies for managing irrigated farming systems to address the identified problems, and the project is meant to benefit smallholder farmers who practice irrigation. If we step away from the particular project for a moment and think more broadly in the context of African smallholder farming systems, African smallholder farming systems can be considered to be complex social ecological systems, as they are made up of people or farmers, and these farmers operate in a certain biophysical environment, and they also farm within socio-economic conditions, certain socio-economic conditions. And for a research project to produce innovations that the farmers can adopt and use, these innovations have to be socially, economically, and biophysically relevant. Which means that they have to work in the social context, they have to work economically, and they have to fit within the biophysical environment. In agricultural research generally, the general experience is that there is low adoption of innovations or technologies that are generated by research. And there are several factors that are responsible for this situation. Some of the factors include the complexity of the technology. In some instances, a technology that has been tested under research conditions and found to work well and is deemed to be simple is not adopted by farmers, is when introduced into a farming system, given the different conditions that prevail in a farming system, it can be found to be complex, and farmers simply don't take it up. Sometimes the information that farmers have and the information that is generated by research are conflicting. And given that conflict of information, then farmers are discouraged from taking up a technology or using information. And then there's always risk associated with a new way of doing things, a different way of doing things. If someone's livelihood is dependent on a certain activity, for instance, farming, and a new practice is introduced or a new technology is introduced. One then weighs the risks of using the new technology against failure. What if the new technology doesn't work? Which then means that their whole livelihood is ruined, and then that discourages the farmers from taking up new technologies. Sometimes the technologies are not flexible enough to fit within the particular farming situation. Certain things have to be done at specific times, and farmers are just not able to do that. And there can be high implementation costs of technologies, both in terms of capital. The farmers maybe don't have the financial resources to see a certain technology through or to adopt a certain technology, or maybe then the labor required to use a certain technology is higher than the farmers can afford or the farmers can access. And then a technology might simply be incompatible with other aspects of farm objectives or the way farmers manage and work. In some cases, a technology might simply not be culturally acceptable. In a research context, and generally in projects that are funded, for instance, by the African Union, the European Union, or by other donors, the aim is to address real-life problems and to solve specific identified problems. And generally, this is meant to result in an improvement of the well-being of the situation of the identified beneficiaries. In a context such as in this project, those would be the farmers. And then the projects are also meant to bring about sustainable solutions or improvements and to generate economic opportunities. The problems are not meant to generate new information, scientific information, or add to scientific knowledge, but they are meant to address specific problems. This then means that research has to be relevant to the needs of the intended beneficiaries. But then, does research always deliver in this way? Does it really address the needs of intended beneficiaries? Take a moment to look at this slide and to think about the message in it. You have probably come across this picture before. This is not a specific research example, but it has parallels to research. You may also want to talk about this slide among yourselves and compare notes about what the message in it is for you as an individual or maybe as a group. But if we look at this project in a research context, the different departments that are represented here, for example, marketing, sales, engineering, can be taken to represent different disciplines in a research project. For instance, in the context of an agricultural project, this could be agronomy, soil scientists, hydrologists, economists, all working on solving a certain problem. But then they are approaching this problem from their different disciplinary perspectives, each viewing it from their own disciplinary perspective. And then they're identifying the problem from their own disciplinary perspective, and they're coming up with a solution from their own disciplinary perspective. And this solution is not necessarily solving the problem or meeting the needs of the beneficiaries or the users of that solution. Secondly, the other message that comes out is that the different disciplines are attempting to solve the problem without consulting the intended beneficiaries or the people who are going to use the solution that they come up with. And they are not involving those people in coming up with the solution. And they are not understanding the problem from the perspective of those people who experience that problem firsthand. And the message in this slide is to highlight the importance of a transdisciplinary approach in attempting to understand the problem and to come up with a solution to the problem. Going back to the Guyani project that I'm using to illustrate the application of a transdisciplinary approach. The whole approach of the Guyani project was premised on trying to avoid a situation where we have different disciplines trying to address a problem from their own perspective without understanding the problem from the perspective of those who experience the problem or the beneficiaries of a research process. And a conscious effort was made at project inception to follow a transdisciplinary process. And this transdisciplinary process was going to be premised on good communication between all parties. That is, the researchers, and the different stakeholders, includes the farmers or the beneficiaries of the research. And this was meant to ensure relevance of the innovations that were going to be developed and their ultimate adoption. To assist this process, a definition of the transdisciplinary approach was decided upon upfront. And in this project, we defined a transdisciplinary approach as the integration of scientific and non-scientific knowledge through the active participation of all stakeholders, including farmers, water managers, retailers, and policymakers. Retailers were important in this project, in this process. They had to be included because farmers are producing for sale, and then it was important to get the perspective of the market in the research process. Water managers were important because the project is an irrigation project and it uses water. Non-governmental organizations were also to be involved as they work with farmers to address agricultural problems and environmental problems. And the inclusion of all relevant disciplines was also ensured, and this includes agronomy, sociology, economics, and others. And this definition of a transdisciplinary approach guided the whole research process. In order to ensure the effective integration of different types of knowledge in the project ensured that different experts from different disciplinary backgrounds would constitute the research team. And in the research team of hydrologists, with agronomists, with soil scientists, with economists, and we have social scientists. And the project was going to work on the basis of sustained interaction between researchers, the researchers from those different disciplines and different stakeholders. And the different stakeholders include the direct beneficiaries of the research, such as farmers and others with an interest and a stake in irrigated agriculture. And the mode of interaction between the stakeholders was going to be structured, and this was going to be achieved through the establishment of platforms for interaction and engagement between researchers and different stakeholders. And this interaction was going to be between researchers and different stakeholders, and also among stakeholders. And this was going to be achieved through two platforms of interaction: the Community of Practice, or COP, and the Learning and Practice Alliance, the LPA. In the next few slides, I'm going to give more information and context to the COP and the LPA. The Learning and Practice Alliance, or the LPA, is a platform which brings together a range of stakeholders from diverse interest groups, disciplines, sectors, and organizations to exchange knowledge and generate innovation. There's a project called the RIPPLE project, which was implemented in Ethiopia, and that project made extensive use of the LPA as a platform for stakeholder interaction. And I've listed the website of the project, and the project has shared some of the experiences that they've had with the use of LPAs. So if you're interested, you can go to that website and read more about the LPAs. LPAs are meant to link research to its end users, and they are meant to be a vehicle for informing policy and practice, because different stakeholders are involved in it. This can then facilitate exchange of information and the use of research in policy. And it is LPAs are also meant to be a bridge between research and policy. And the target group for LPAs, or the people who should be involved in LPAs, are all those with an interest in integrated agriculture. That is in the context of a project, of this project. And the scale of an LPA is generally more regional and national level, for instance, provincial level and national level. And in addition to facilitating interaction between research and stakeholders, LPAs can also be used to evaluate research and to disseminate it through appropriate channels. The stakeholders who are involved in LPAs generally have their own networks, and this would be, in some cases, additional to what the researchers have. And then those networks could be useful for disseminating research findings. A COP, or community of practice, has been described as a group of people who have practical experience in a certain domain and build a social structure or a community of practice, or a community around their practice. If you are interested in reading more about the COPs, I've included a reference from Ninja. It gives an interesting description of communities of practice. And communities of practice represent a potential win-win partnership between researchers and users of research in a research context. Because researchers can learn and understand more about a problem, a situation, from the community of practice, while the community of practice can also benefit from interaction with researchers and learn from researchers. And a community of practice can also be useful for capacity building, both of the researchers that are involved in the research and of farmers in the context of an agricultural project. And in this context, the target group of the community of practice will be farmers. And the scale of a community of practice is more local level, unlike the LPA. COPs are generally focused directly on the research site in the immediate local area. And in addition, communities of practice are meant to encourage peer-to-peer learning by being a platform for farmers, for instance, to interact and share knowledge that peer-to-peer learning can work in. And then LPAs and COPs are not meant to operate in isolation. There is meant to be interaction between LPAs and COPs and exchange of information between these two stakeholder platforms, so that then this can inform the research process better. It is important to point out that communities of practice and learning and practice alliances are not the magic wand for enabling participatory research and problem solving. And these platforms need to be managed appropriately and supported to ensure that they work as intended. However, it is necessary to point out that researchers should not micromanage these platforms, but they should give stakeholders the space to operate in these platforms. And researchers can provide the support or information as needed. Some factors for ensuring the success of COPs include identifying and engaging appropriate participants in an open and transparent manner, and having clear terms of engagement for the COPs. And these terms of engagement have to be defined by and for the members themselves. And these platforms should foster a sense of belonging for the stakeholders who participate in them. In a research project, having structured stakeholder engagement, such as through COPs and LPAs, can have its advantages and disadvantages. COPs and LPAs are meant to ensure that research is informed by and driven by stakeholder needs. However, identification of stakeholders is not a straightforward, easy process, and there has to be proper identification of stakeholders, and there can be hidden agendas in the process of identifying and involving the stakeholders in a research process. For instance, some people who should participate in a research process might be hindered from doing so through local power dynamics. And LPAs and COPs are meant to be viable for learning and capacity building. But then in the real world, you find that there are different stakeholder priorities. Some farmers would rather be doing something else, while others would rather be focusing on something else. And these different stakeholder needs can make it difficult to structure learning and capacity building initiatives. LPAs and COPs are meant to facilitate uptake and scaling up of research findings, but then this costs time and effort, and there have to be adequate incentives for stakeholders to participate in COPs and LPAs. And the incentives that are provided for participation have to be thought through carefully. For instance, it's not a good idea to use money or to throw money at stakeholders in order to, as an incentive for them to participate, because clearly that is not sustainable. And then the process of facilitating LPAs and COPs and ensuring that they work takes a lot of time and effort and skill, and that has to be provided for by a research project. And COPs and LPAs are meant to identify and address contextual factors in a research project. But then these are difficult realities. That process can be complicated by local power asymmetries, different worldviews, can make it different to actually contextualize a project. The next few slides are going to focus on the actual process of stakeholder engagement that was followed in this project. However, before I move into that process, it is necessary to understand, to provide some background information on South Africa's system of government. This is important for appreciating how the stakeholder engagement was done, why certain points were approached, why certain departments at certain levels were approached. South Africa is a three-tier system of government. There is national government, and then the country is divided into provinces, and there are 9 provinces. And then there's provincial government. And then under each province is divided into a number of district municipalities. And the number of district municipalities is dependent on the size of a province, that is the geographical area and the population. And each district municipality in turn is divided into a number of local municipalities. And government departments are represented at these different levels of national government. If we take the example of the Department of Agriculture, at national government level, there are officers who work in the Department of Agriculture, and they look at issues at national level. And then we have officers who work at provincial level, and they're responsible for provincial level agricultural issues. And then we have officers who work at district municipal level and at local municipal level. The officers who work at the local municipality level are the people who are in contact with farmers, who provide extension and advisory services to farmers. Going back to the Guyana project. At project inception, when the project proposal was developed, the study area was identified in broad terms that it was going to be in the Limpopo province and in the Guyana district. But when the project was finally processed and the funding was made available to start the work, it was then now necessary to identify exactly how to engage with the stakeholders and get the project going on the ground. The first process was to identify the key stakeholders in the context of this project. This was an agricultural project, and a key stakeholder was the Department of Agriculture, and the most appropriate level was going to be the Provincial Department of Agriculture. So the project made initial contact with the Provincial Department of Agriculture in the Limpopo province, and this was through telephone calls and emails. This was followed with a face-to-face meeting with the Department of Agriculture. And the objective basically was to sell the project to the department and to explore partnership building with the department, since they were a key stakeholder group and they were the vehicle through the project was going to be able to access farmers and establish trials on the ground. And in that meeting, the objectives of the project were spelled out. And then the methodology and the concept of the LPAs and COPs was also spelled out to the department. And in that process, the researchers asked the department to help with the identification of the larger stakeholder group to involve in the project. And this group would typically comprise the Learning and Practice Alliance, or the LPA. And following on that, it was then necessary to organize a meeting of the larger stakeholder group. The second step in the stakeholder engagement was to lay the foundation for the LPA. This happened through a provincial level meeting. And this was a meeting of the larger stakeholder group. And the participants in that included different government departments with prime interests on irrigated agriculture. This would be the Department of Agriculture, Department of Environmental Affairs, Water, Planning, Forestry. National non-governmental organizations were also involved to work with farmers, work on environmental issues in farming context. Farmers' organizations were also invited, farmers' unions. The business sector was also involved, and this included retailers and buyers of agricultural produce, because farmers produce for sale. In the project, researchers were involved. The objectives of that meeting were to introduce the project. These objectives and approach were spelled out, and to discuss the actual problems which the project should address. The meeting also took the opportunity to share a vision for the project from the perspective of the researchers, and to ask the stakeholders what vision they would have for a project of this nature and what change it should bring. Stakeholder participation in the context of the LPAs and COPs also came up, and the stakeholders were invited to participate and set up an LPA. Part of the discussion covered the selection of a site for the project. When the project, at project inception, the location was identified in very broad terms, but at this juncture it was now necessary to actually locate a specific site within the province and within the district where the project was actually going to be situated. A process of stakeholder mapping was also followed, where the different stakeholders who should be involved in the project were identified, and who should be in the LPA and COP. And the discussion also covered the operational level of the LPA. Was it going to be best for the LPA to operate at provincial level or district level? And then the potential terms of engagement of LPA members was also discussed. Following the provincial level meeting, a meeting was held at the district level, and this involved different stakeholders. And the participants at district level were very similar to the provincial level participants, but these were just district level representatives of the different government departments, of farmer organizations, and farmers were also represented there in project researchers. And the issues covered in the meeting were the same as those at provincial level. And this also included a discussion on the potential sites for the project. In this meeting, the first farmers meeting was also discussed. And that is the meeting that was then going to set up the community of practice. The farmers meeting was held a day after the district level stakeholder meeting. And this meeting was held at local municipality level. And the participants were the local agricultural extension officers, those who operate at the municipal level. And these were actually the people who helped organize this meeting. And the largest number of people who were in that meeting were the farmers. These are farmers who practice irrigation and the project researchers. The meeting, the agenda of the meeting was to introduce the project, the objectives and the approach that was going to be used, and also discuss stakeholder participation through the LPAs and the COP, and inviting the participants to participate in the setting up of a community of practice. The meeting also had a discussion around the problems faced by farmers, so as to get the perspective of the farmers and their suggestions for solutions. And this was actually the beginning of the process of problem and solution identification. And this was what was going to inform the research agenda. In the farmers' meeting, a vision for the project was also articulated, and the farmers also gave their vision for the project and their perspective of what it should achieve. Part of the discussion also covered selection of a site for the project and the potential terms of engagement with the community of practice. After the meeting, a visit to potential project sites was made, and this visit included farmers, researchers, and extension workers went on this visit, and the purpose was just to see the different farms and the situation, and this was meant to inform the actual identification of a site. Following the different meetings, the researchers compiled reports on the different meetings and circulated these reports to all the stakeholders who had attended the meetings. These reports also outlined the next steps, the LPA and the COP meetings that were going to be held to define the research agenda and the problem and potential solution identification. About 5 months after the first stakeholder meeting and the first farmers meeting, researchers went back to the project site. And the purpose of that second visit was actually to identify the problems and potential solutions, to start defining the research agenda. And in line with the transdisciplinary approach of the project, multiple perspectives on the problem and the solution to the problem affecting the farming area were sought. The first part was to see the problems through the eyes of the farmers. In order to achieve this, a transect walk was conducted through an irrigation scheme, with farmers, researchers, and extension workers taking part in the walk. The research team lent cameras to farmers, and farmers took photographs of the problems they faced as we conducted the walk, and they described the problems. And the researchers and the extension workers documented these problems. Following on that, a workshop was held, a community of practice workshop or meeting was held, and this was a 2-day meeting. In that meeting, there was presentation of results of the transect walk. And then there was also discussion and documentation of general problems, because the discussion on general problems was meant to capture general problems faced by different farmers, because the farmers went on not all farmers went on the transect walk. And then that discussion and documentation of the general problems was followed by a prioritization of the problem, and a voting process was used to prioritize the problem, because what emerged was that the farmers faced different problems. But some of the problems were unique to certain groups of farmers. For instance, there were farmers who had perfected their agronomic production practices and could manage their irrigation well, but their main concern was to do with marketing, accessing markets beyond their area, and accessing national markets. But then there were farmers who were grappling with the basic agronomic and production. And then in the prioritization of problems, then it was necessary to actually vote on the problems to ensure that the problems that were identified as priorities were problems that were faced by the majority and that were perceived as pressing by the majority. Following the prioritization, there was a discussion on the potential solutions to the priority problems. And then following on that, then there was also a discussion around selection of farmers to represent the community of practice in an LPA meeting that was going to be held the next day. Because of the necessity for ensuring that the LPA and the COP don't operate in isolation but interact, it was necessary to have farmers attend the LPA meetings and represent the farmers' perspective in that meeting. The researchers documented everything that took place in the meeting, and then there was also agreement on the next steps following this problem and solution identification, and a decision on the location of the trials was also made. The next problem and solution identification meeting was the LPA meeting. In this meeting, the results of the transect work were presented by farmers. And this LPA meeting was actually the one that was attended by the broad group of stakeholders operating at district level. And the priority problems that is identified in the COP meeting was also presented. And the potential solutions were also presented. This was followed by an exercise of identification and prioritizing problems from the perspective of the LPA and identification of solutions, potential solutions to those problems. It was interesting to note that the LPA observed problems from a different level in comparison with the COP. The LPA had a more regional perspective of problems. For instance, the pressing problem of shortages of water or inadequate water for irrigation in Guyana was perceived differently. The LPA perceived this problem from a catchment level, whereas in the COP, the problem was perceived at farm level. The farmers simply realized that there was no water in the reservoirs or in the rivers that were meant to provide them with water. But the LPA identified that this problem extended beyond the agriculture sector. It involved other users of water, and its solution lay in managing water demand at catchment level. And then in the LPA meeting, there was agreement on the next steps, and this was going to be the definition of the research agenda for the project. The next step was to design innovations. So researchers, after the different meetings, wrote reports on the meetings and circulated them. Based on the priority problems and solutions identified by farmers in the COP meeting and in the Learning and Practice Alliance meeting, researchers designed what we called best bet innovations. That is, the innovations that were likely to address the problems that were identified in the solutions as they came up. And then when those best bet innovations were identified, these were discussed with the local Department of Agriculture, with the extension workers who work with the farmers and the COP and LPA members. And then after these were approved by the department, they were presented to the community of practice and they were discussed. The farmers gave their input on those and they approved those best bet innovations. After identifying the best bet innovations and having them approved, the next step was to actually implement the trials or to test the innovations. And the practical aspects of implementation had to be dealt with. That was the establishment of the trials. What was supposed to be done, where was it supposed to be done, when and how. And then the role of farmers and extension workers had to be spelled out. Farmers were involved in monitoring the trials, managing the trials, and to a limited extent in data collection, and the extension workers as well. And then there was the issue of installing capacity and using the capacity, the equipment properly, and building capacity both on the part of farmers and extension workers to use the equipment. And then there was also the issue of ownership of equipment. In this particular trial, equipment was installed on certain farms, on certain lands. But then the question arose on when the trials ended, the farmers then get to own the equipment. But then we realized that giving certain farmers equipment was not going to be fair, in the sense that those farmers wouldn't get the opportunity to host the trial, would feel left out, and this could fuel conflict within the farmers, the community of farmers. So it was decided that the equipment would belong to the Department of Agriculture. We would take the equipment away at the end of the trial, but would use the equipment for demonstration trials. Timetables had to be worked out and agreed to for the different activities. And the way data collection had to be done also had to be agreed to and worked out. And the assessment criteria, it also had to be agreed on. Apart from the scientific criteria, for instance, of yield in hectares, in tons per hectare, a criteria that farmers found valuable had to be incorporated into the research. For example, criteria such as the amount of labor that was required, the time that it took to do certain operations, had to be incorporated, and the measurements had to make sense from a research and from a farmer's perspective. And then in that process of implementing the trials, the farmers also learned to take over and manage the process. There was a COP meeting that was organized for farmers by farmers, and the Farmers' Day was held to assess the trials and to discuss them. And this was the farmers sharing this information among themselves. And then there was also an ongoing process of analyzing the trials and the information that emerged, and this was meant to inform further trials. In summary, the process of applying the transdisciplinary process involved stakeholder engagement. That was the establishment and launch of this, through the establishment and launch of the COP of the LPA. And the next step was problem identification, and this was done together with stakeholders, identifying and prioritizing the problems and identifying potential solutions to those problems. And the next step was the co-design of innovations, or the actual design of the trials. Researchers used information from the scoping exercises or the interaction with the COP and LPA to design best bet innovations, and these were presented to stakeholders for discussion, modification, and approval. And the next step was to implement the innovations, that is to test and assess the innovations in collaboration with stakeholders, farmers, extension workers, and other stakeholders. And the last step was information dissemination and capacity building. The project is ongoing, and this process of information dissemination and capacity building is ongoing. And this involved elements of training and capacity building of farmers and extension workers, information sharing and dissemination among the different groups. What are some of the challenges that we faced in applying transdisciplinary process to a research project? One of the factors was affordability. There has to be a compromise between what is desirable and what is affordable. In the particular context of the Guyana project, it would have been desirable to have the LPA established at both the provincial and the district level. But then we realized that it was going to be very expensive to have the LPA at two levels, and we had to compromise, and the compromise ultimately was to have the LPA at district level. But having an LPA at district level means that the participation of provincial level stakeholders is limited, as it is expensive for them to travel to meetings at the LPA at the district level, and their interaction is mainly through receiving reports on LPA meetings at district level. The second aspect was reconciling researcher priorities with stakeholder priorities. We found that the different disciplines that were represented in the research in their own perspective and their own priorities, and in some instances researchers would think that certain problem was priority because of their disciplinary training, the way that they viewed things, but farmers would have a different perspective. And as researchers, we had to keep reminding ourselves that the purpose of this research was to address farmers' problems, but not to see issues and problems from our different disciplinary perspectives. And the other challenge that came up was the level or scale of viewing the issues or problems. This was especially evident in the COP and the LPA platforms, where at COP level problems were viewed from a farm level, and then the LPA they were viewed from a more regional level. But then it became evident that some problems can only be solved, for instance, at a regional level. For instance, the problem of water shortages could be addressed through water demand management at catchment scale. But if at local level, for instance, farmers did everything right in terms of water conservation, with their agronomic practices right, put in place water conservation measures, but then there was no water that was being released for agriculture at a catchment scale, their efforts then weren't going to yield anything positive. The other aspect that had to be dealt with was the influencing policy versus influencing practice. Because it's expensive to engage with everybody to the same level. For instance, engaging with the provincial level, excuse me, versus engaging effectively with stakeholders at the local level. By engaging at the local level, it is possible to influence practice. But then sometimes influencing practice without influencing policy is not enough to bring about desired change, because decisions that are made at policy level ultimately influence what happens at local level. And those issues there has to be some balance. And the other problem that we had to grapple with was dealing with problems beyond the scope of the project. During the problem identification in the COPs, farmers kept referring to the problem of accessing finance for agriculture, and they expected the project to address this problem for them. But the mandate of the project was such that it couldn't address financing because the project couldn't provide agricultural financing. However, due to the linked nature, due to the fact that an agricultural system is a social-ecological system, witnesses different facets, ignoring the problem that farmers had and which impacted on the way they operated was not a solution. So we had to address that problem somehow, and the way that we could address that problem was to promise farmers that would take their problem to experts such as in universities and get them to advise farmers on how to access agricultural finance, who to approach for agricultural finance, and how to put together proposals that would ensure that they got funding for agriculture. And the other aspect was managing stakeholder expectations while maintaining interest in the project. And this is related to the problem of dealing with problems beyond the scope of the project. Stakeholders have expectations when they participate in the project, and sometimes their expectations are beyond the mandate of a research project, like we experienced. But then for the research team, it is necessary to maintain stakeholder interest. So it is somehow these factors have to be balanced, stakeholder expectations within what the project can provide and maintaining the interest of those stakeholders. The other challenge that we found was incorporating different stakeholder needs into a research agenda. As I highlighted before, with farmers at different levels of operation, some ran fairly sophisticated operations in terms of their agronomic practices, and were looking to expand their marketing, and were concerned about things such as warehousing, packaging facilities for their produce, and linking to national markets. Whereas some were grappling with basic agronomic issues, operating basic drip equipment. And in defining a research agenda, you find that issues from these different groups of farmers come up. And those issues then are addressed in a project, because a project cannot address everything. And linked to that is prioritizing problems. Whose problem is most urgent and whose problem is a priority. So in applying transdisciplinary approaches, then all these issues have to be addressed, and researchers have to find creative ways of working around these problems, finding solutions to these challenges that are acceptable to farmers and that ensure that the project goes forward. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you. I hope that you find the experiences that we shared useful, and that you can use some of the experiences and the methods that were applied, or adapt some of them for use in your own research projects.